What we want to do is continue the discussion we had already started. If you remember, we're discussing three important economic concepts. These are concepts that we'll come back to time and time again, so we want to be sure and understand them very well. The first one is a consumer price index, and if you remember, that is an index of the cost of purchasing consumer goods. There's a market basket that gets priced, a market basket of consumer goods, and that's priced each month and compared to its level in a base year, a base period. And so if we see the consumer price index standing at, let's say, 160, just to pick a number, what that means is that the price level is 1.6 times the base year level. If the consumer price index was 220, that would be 2.2 times the price level in the base year. So anyway, that was our first concept. The second, which we we started talking about and will continue today, is the unemployment rate. And we had already begun talking not directly about the unemployment rate, but about some related concepts. If you remember, we had the entire, the civilian non-institutional population over 16 years old. And today I'll just call that population. But it is the civilian population, not people in the military, for example. It's the non-institutional population, not people in jail, for example. And it's the over 16 or 16 and over population. The idea is that you need to be 16 or over to be really eligible to work. And that doesn't mean that people have never worked that were under 16, but nowadays that's sort of a threshold, we would say, to enter the labor force. Out of this population of people, and we said last time, I believe, 210 million people, more or less, in this civilian, non-institutional adult population. Out of the 210 million people, what we have is some people who are in the civilian labor force, and other people who are just not in the labor force. And I better look at my numbers here. My numbers tell me that this is 140 million people that's in the civilian labor force. And of course, we're talking round numbers as opposed to the exact number down to several decimal points. Not in the labor force. Look, everybody that's an adult is either in the labor force or they're not in the labor force, obviously. And so if we have 140 million out of the 210 that are in the labor force, we have another 70 million that are not in the labor force. Out of everybody who's in the labor force, that 140 million, what we have is people who are employed and people who are unemployed. How many do you think we have of those? The number of people who are employed is about 133 million, and the number of people who are unemployed, about 7 million. So we start with this population, and you can see that what would it be, about 3% of that population, of the total population, is unemployed, the 7 million divided by 210. Okay. The unemployment rate, let's write down a formula for that. Unemployment rate equals the number of people unemployed divided by the number of people in the civilian labor force. Well, how many people are in the civilian labor force? How many people are unemployed? We've got 7 million people unemployed and 140 million people in the civilian labor force. Oh, by the way, sometimes you multiply by 100 to get rid of the decimal sign. But anyway, this is, maybe I ought to look, this is about 5%. That's a little high. I've rounded off. The actual unemployment rate's a little bit below 5%, but that'll give you a general idea. If you hear somebody say that the unemployment rate's 5%, then what they're saying is that the number of people unemployed, those people who are unemployed, they are in the labor force. Let me go back to here. The civilian labor force includes people who are unemployed. These people want to work. They're looking for work. If you just want to work but you're not looking, you're counted not in the labor force. You have to actually be out there to be counted in the civilian labor force. You either have to have a job or you have to be looking for a job. And so anyway, this number of people, the number of people unemployed, divided by this number of people, the civilian labor force, that's our unemployment rate. Okay. By the way, since I've got that, I thought I would go back and mention something that we talked about before. This ratio, the ratio of the civilian labor force to the population, and that's again the civilian non-institutional adult population. I call that the labor force participation rate last time. Labor force participation rate, it's out of everybody, what percent of them want jobs? Have jobs, want jobs. And if you'll remember, I think that this was, I've already got the numbers right. 140 over 210 equals about 67% of everybody in the United States that's 16 or over. But about 2/3 of them either have jobs or are looking for jobs. And that is a very high number. I think when I was a kid, this number was closer to 50–55%. And what's happened over the years to drive this up, I can mention a couple of things that are sort of obvious. The women's movement that's gotten females out of the household and into the labor force, that's driven millions of additional people into the labor force and pushed this number up. A second thing that's been going on is the baby boom generation, which when I was a kid, there were a number of baby boomers, including myself, who were not in the labor force, too young and so forth. And so what's happened is the baby boom generation has aged, and everybody in that huge population, I think there's 78 million people in that generation, the baby boom generation. But out of that 78 million people, now they're all old enough to get jobs, and a very high percent of them are in the labor force. And so those two things have really driven this number up. As I say, I think it was on the order of 55%, something like that, when I was a kid, and nowadays it's considerably higher. And you might go, yeah, 55%, 67%, no big deal. But, you know, when you're talking about another 10%, let's just use that number, 10% of 210 million, we're talking an extra 21 million people looking for jobs. And an extra 21 million people looking for jobs, that's a heck of a lot of people. And we've found jobs for most of them. And I'll remind you that in, let's say, Europe, for example, the total number of people working today is really no higher than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Europe has a very difficult time generating job growth. Well, here in the United States, as I say, we've got another 20–25 million people that have entered the labor market in the last couple of decades, and those people have found jobs, found work. Our economy is an engine of growth. It's not only creating a higher level of production and income, but also more jobs for people. So anyway, here's some of the relationships then. It's a little bit difficult to keep these in mind, but not too tough once you just kind of think your way through them. These people here are unemployed, but they are still considered to be in the labor force. But they're not working, and these people aren't working, and maybe there's a tendency to kind of group those up together and let on like they're the same, but they're not. These people do not want jobs. The people who are not in the labor force, these people do want jobs. They just happen not to have a job right now. But they have to look each month at least be looking for jobs, inquiring about jobs in order to be counted in the labor force. What happens is the Labor Department will come to homes. They survey homes every month. I think between 50 and 60,000 homes get surveyed every month. And so the surveyor comes to the door and says basically how many people are in this household that are age 16 and above, how many of those people have jobs and were employed at least 1 hour during the month, how many people were not employed but were looking for jobs, actively looking for jobs. And so these numbers are all being written down. How many people then are in the household that are 16 and above, but either don't have a job or not looking for a job? Those people are not in the labor force. And these kinds of surveys get done every month, as I say, between 50 and 60,000 households. What do they call this? Current population survey. You don't really need to know that. But if there's anybody that wants to know, I don't mind telling you. And this current population survey is conducted by the same people that do the census. And this is the Census Bureau, which is part of the Commerce Department, which is itself one of the governmental, one of the cabinet level departments, the Commerce Department. Anyway, questions about any of this stuff? Why is there unemployment? Why? Economists say that there's unemployment for three main reasons. The first of those reasons, and we give names to them first of all, the first type of unemployment is frictional unemployment. With frictional unemployment, we just have the kind of unemployment that occurs when people are between jobs. And they're just between jobs, and I can give you a couple of good reasons. One is maybe they were fired. The employer just says, this is not a good match. You know, I don't like your face, or I don't like your work, or I don't like what time you show up in the morning. But for one reason or another, maybe the employee gets fired. And another thing might be the employee might just say, I don't like working here. There are better places to work. And so the worker might quit the job, or the employer might quit the worker and say, you know, you're fired, or don't come back, or whatever. And then in the time that it takes that person to go out and get another job, that person's frictionally unemployed. It's frictional unemployment. Okay? And so just to take an example, suppose that I got fired, and then I went and looking for another job and got a job teaching at Drury. And maybe I get fired in, March, and then I find a job at Drury maybe in May is when they tell me, yeah, we're looking for somebody, we'll hire you. And then I don't actually go to work for them until, let's say, late August or early September when the school year starts. So then I would be unemployed for a few months in there, and that would be considered frictional unemployment. I've got the skills to get the new job. I'm going to move to that new job. It's just that it takes me time to do that. And so that's frictional unemployment. And here's what we say about frictional unemployment. Don't count on getting rid of that. And this is not really even a major problem. It's really kind of a good thing, to tell you the truth. If you can believe that about unemployment. It's a good thing to have frictional unemployment in this sense. Look, if you don't have a good match between the worker and the job, we don't want the worker doing that job. If that worker's not up to performing, where that the employer thinks, get out of here, then we don't want that worker there. We think it's a good thing for that worker to leave that job where he's not getting the job done and go to a job where he can do it. Or if the worker says, I hate these, my coworkers, my boss, the time of the day I have to work, the location, I don't like this, then we don't want that worker to be there. We want that worker to move to another job where he or she prefers the working conditions. So anyway, frictional unemployment is kind of a good thing. We would rather the world was perfect, where nobody needed to move between jobs, where nobody was worthy of being fired and every workplace was lovely and all the workers wanted to stay there. That would be preferable. But given the realities of the world, then we like to see people moving from where their time is not very valuable to where it's more valuable. So this is not a bad thing, not something to be struggled against or whatever, to be dealt with. Structural unemployment. Structural unemployment. Here's what changes, and by the way, let me just kind of jot these down. Shift in demand. Changes in production costs. I'll leave it at that. There are things that can happen in the economy, for example, shifts in demand. Let's go back to the 1970s. Here's what happened in the 1970s. The price of oil went way up, and the price of gasoline went way up. Everybody's familiar with that. So what happened? And the answer is, when the price of gasoline and oil went up, then people started driving smaller cars. That's pretty simple. They started doing other things as well, but driving smaller cars. Why? To get better gas mileage. When gasoline prices, they went from 30 cents a gallon to over $1 a gallon, and within just a few years, so quadruple the price of gasoline. What happened was people started saying, I want a smaller car. Now here's the thing, the American auto industry, Ford and General Motors and Chrysler and back then American Motors, it's no longer Chrysler now, is it? It's Daimler Chrysler. No longer an American company, now a German company. But anyway, back in the 1970s, when people said, I want a smaller car, they turned to the American auto industry, and the American auto industry says, well, we don't produce very many small cars. And the ones we produce are not very good. They didn't actually say that, but the customers knew, so they didn't have to. Not very good. So what the customers did is they said, let's buy foreign cars. And so what happened is Americans started buying a large number of foreign small cars. This would be a shift in the structure of the economy. Demand shifted, and it was originally caused by a change in the cost of energy. But what happened was there was a shift in demand, and there wasn't a new job for people to go to with their skills. There were people in the United States used to producing, let's say, Lincoln Continentals, but the demand for Lincoln Continentals went down. These people could produce smaller cars, but the small car company is overseas. And so people with skills looked around, where am I going to go to work next? And the answer is no place, because we don't need people who can produce big cars. And if you want to produce a small car, you have to move to Japan, let's say. And people didn't do that, so they just couldn't find a place to go to work. Let me back up to frictional unemployment. In this first case, people had the skills. You're out of work, but you got the skill to go get the other job. I gave the example of me being fired or leaving this university and going over to Drury and doing basically the same thing as I'm doing here. Putting people to sleep and grading their tests. Okay, so anyway, well, you know, that's what I do. I've got to recognize that. That frictional unemployment, we have the skills to change jobs, but with structural unemployment, you're thrown out of work by maybe a shift in demand or a shift in production costs. You're thrown out of work, and you want to go and do that same job someplace else, but there's no job for you, no opening. This is structural unemployment. The structure of the economy has changed, and it's changed in such a way as you're out looking for work, and there's nobody who wants to hire you. Structural unemployment. Don't have the right skills. Now, here's the thing is, we really kind of hate this, you know. We don't like a situation where people don't have the right skills. One of the things that results from this structural unemployment is people go back to school. Go back to school. Now, everybody doesn't go back to school, but I'm saying that's one way of dealing with this is retraining. There have been a lot of layoffs in the United States in recent years, and that's the trend. Go back to school, get retrained for a different kind of job. But you know, this takes time. If you're going to be trained for a different type of job, there's no job for you to do that's sort of like what you're familiar with doing, and you have to go back to school. How long are you going to be unemployed? A month or two? I don't think so. You could be unemployed many months, maybe a year or two, and potentially longer. So the point is that this structural unemployment, it's a little bit more of a severe problem, and yet we don't want to prevent that from happening. We want to be able, we consumers, we want to be able to just say, I don't want a big car, I want to buy a small car, and if that creates unemployment, so be it. I don't want to be worried about that. I want to drive the car I want to drive. We need to have an economy that can adjust to shifts in consumer demand and changes in production costs. Let's say wages go way up and well, let me not go down that path and give more examples, but the point is that we want an economy that's flexible and that if changes in sort of underlying economic conditions occur, then we want to say, well, I'm sorry, but there's no more work for you. You have to leave. You know what they do in some countries, and particularly overseas in Germany, different places in Europe, what they have is a lot of rules and regulations that make it difficult for the employer to lay off the worker. And so if there's a shift in demand, I gave the example, no more demand for big cars, the demand for small cars is taking up foreign, or causing us to import foreign cars, no more production of big cars. What happens? Well, and I'm saying in the United States, we say, too bad you're out of work, but in several European countries and elsewhere, what they say is, well, no, we don't lay anybody off. Maybe there's a rule or regulation that prevents that. That's been the rule of the land pretty much in Japan over the years, has been lifetime employment. You go to work for us, we keep you on forever. So what happens if the demand goes away for the product? And the answer is the company just finds something for that worker to do and keeps on paying him. And after a while, you know, you can only sustain so much of that and the company's out of business. In Europe, it's more a case, rather than just sort of companies guarantee the workers lifetime employment, it's more a case of the law guarantees that. The law in Germany, for example, they have something called co-determination laws in Germany, and what happens is the workers' unions have a representative that sits on the board, the governing board of big companies. And so then when the big company has a downturn and they say, oh, we need to lay off some workers, then the union member of the board, they say, oh no, we're not going to let you do that, we veto that, we vote against it. And so it's hard for companies to lay the workers off. So what happens? The company just keeps paying the employee. The employee just sits there and does very little work because his job's been abolished for all intents and purposes. So what we have is a big, inefficient company paying employees that are not getting the work done. And it's not the employees that can't work, it's just the situation where they haven't been told, hey, your skills no longer match the things that consumers want to buy anymore. And so people sit there, they aren't doing the work, but they're not getting retrained either. So the economy's not improving. These workers are just basically working at half of capacity. They're not getting retrained. They're never going to move to a job that they're better suited for if they're not being retrained, if they continue to be paid by their employer. So what I'm saying to you is that we hate unemployment just as a sort of our philosophy. Don't like unemployment. Like it that when people can go out and get a job and work. Yes, that is our philosophy, but it's also our philosophy to have an economy. It's flexible, and that if consumers want to buy something different, they can buy something different. And if that means people lose jobs, so be it. We want that kind of an economy too. So what I'm saying to you is this structural unemployment is considered undesirable, but it's very, very challenging to reduce that. Very challenging without just saying, we're not going to let consumer demand or production costs control the way our economy operates. But if we do that, I mentioned to you a while ago, not only does Europe say we're going to protect all these jobs, think about the consequences of this. Consumer demand shifts, the company says we need to lay off the workers because people are no longer buying our products, and then the government comes along and says you can't lay off those workers. Think what the management of the company starts saying. Next time demand picks up and people start buying more of the product, it's time to hire some workers. And the company says, no, I'm not going to hire any workers because if we hire workers, we got them forever. We can't get rid of them. And if we can't get rid of them, and why can't we? Because of these co-determination and other laws. If we can't get rid of these workers, let's don't hire them in the first place. And so what I'm telling you is that in Japan, Germany and France and some other European countries, they are trying to prevent job losses through their laws, but the longer term effects is to make employers just say, I don't want to hire anybody because I can't ever get rid of them. And so we find a situation where Europe is not creating new jobs. In the United States, where you can lay off your workers or fire them or close down your plant and move, in the United States where it's possible to do that, you would think, oh, we're going to have more unemployment. And the answer is, yeah, we do, but it's a short-term kind of unemployment. The worker goes and does something else. The company goes and hires workers in some other town. The United States creates jobs. And so it's sort of a paradox, but that's the way it works. Or is it maybe ironic rather than a paradox? I'll let you decide on that one, and I'll go ahead to number 3. Number 3, cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment. This is really the kind of the kind of unemployment we are most concerned with in this course. And I started to say the word and cut myself off there. Macroeconomic unemployment. These first two kinds of unemployment that I've talked about, frictional and structural, those really have microeconomic causes. right? It's, oh, I don't like working here. I quit my job. I go get another job. In between times I'm unemployed. Or consumers shift their demand from one kind of car to another kind of car. Or well, at one point in the past, they stopped buying the, horses and buggy whips and shifted over to cars. Structural unemployment. These are really microeconomic in nature. This last one, though, cyclical unemployment, it's a macroeconomic type of unemployment. It affects pretty much everyone, and I don't mean to say everybody's unemployed, but this kind of unemployment is basically the consequence of changes in macroeconomic conditions. Okay. We talked about the business cycle the other day. Let me just kind of remind you by putting here's months and years. And then real GDP. I know we haven't really talked about that very much. I'll come back to it. But I talked to you about the business cycle, how we go from peak to trough to peak and so forth, this being a cycle. Well, this thing right here, when the economy turns down, that's the cause of cyclical unemployment, is when the economy just slows down. It's been growing, it's been in the expansion phase, but then it reaches a peak, and then boom, we're into a recession. And when we're into a recession and output in the economy is lagging, it's slowing down, people aren't buying, so then companies don't produce, don't sell, that's the period when we have cyclical unemployment. And that's the kind of unemployment we're going to be most concerned with. If you want to fight frictional unemployment, or you want to fight structural unemployment, what you need is microeconomic policies. Frictional unemployment and structural unemployment, those are really microeconomic in nature. That is to say, it has to do with the operation of individual markets and shifts in demands in those markets and so forth. These are microeconomic in nature, and so to deal with them, you need microeconomic policies. But cyclical unemployment, the unemployment that occurs when the economy enters a recession or a downturn, that's the kind of unemployment that we fight with macroeconomic policies. So anyway, let me just kind of leave it at that in terms of this macro. We are mainly going to be talking about cyclical unemployment. Let's add some of these things up and see what we have. If we have the number of people frictionally unemployed, and we divide by the civilian labor force, that gives us a frictional unemployment rate. If we take the number of people who are structurally unemployed, and divide by the civilian labor force, what do you think we have? We have the structural unemployment rate. And then if we have the number of people who are cyclically unemployed and divide by the civilian labor force, we have the cyclical unemployment rate. So the total unemployment rate is just these three things added together. The unemployment rate is equal to the frictional rate plus the structural unemployment rate plus the cyclical unemployment rate. Most of the time, people just talk about the unemployment rate, so they're talking about this all-inclusive measure. Here's a term, though, you need to be familiar with. If you add together these two types of microeconomic unemployment, you add those together, these two things added together are called the natural rate of unemployment. That's the natural rate of unemployment. And so the total unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate plus the cyclical rate. And so now what we've done is we've divided this into two parts, the microeconomic unemployment and the macroeconomic unemployment. And by the way, we will use that term, the natural rate of unemployment, quite a bit as the semester goes along. This natural rate of unemployment, and by the way, these are all concepts that we can understand, you know, thinking about them, talking about them as economists. We can understand these. But people don't like wear a sign that says, I'm structurally unemployed or I'm frictionally unemployed. People themselves oftentimes don't know. So what we are talking about is we're trying to understand the causes of unemployment and therefore what kinds of policies are best at dealing with them. But it's not necessary for each person to know what kind of unemployment they're suffering with. This unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment, is around 4 to 5.5%, someplace in that range. Is where the natural rate of unemployment is for the United States nowadays, and probably 4 to 5%. But let's leave it at that, 4 to 5.5. So here's what I'm saying to you is, let's say somebody told you, hey, the unemployment rate's 7%. Let's just say you heard that. How much is the cyclical unemployment rate? If the total unemployment rate is 7%, and let's just for 1 second here say that the natural rate of unemployment's 4, so then that would mean that the cyclical unemployment rate's 3%. Right? We know this number. This is measured by the government, and statistics are released monthly. The the natural rate of unemployment, that doesn't change very much. We don't do a recalculation every month. We just say, well, you know, it's about 4 to 5.5%. Let's say it's 4, so then we know that the difference between 7 and 4 is 3, and that's the cyclical unemployment rate. If this was 5.5, the natural rate, then what would we have here? 1.5%. So we sort of have some boundaries there that we could say, well, you know, the cyclical unemployment rate's at 1.5 to 3%. That's the problem that we're going to try and discuss, or not going to try, we're going to discuss this semester, is the macroeconomic policies that can be brought to bear on that cyclical unemployment rate and bring it down. What's the unemployment rate right now? It's in the neighborhood of 4.5%. For the last couple of years, it's been, I think, between 5% and a little bit lower for the last couple of years. Questions about this? Now, one final thing, terminology. Well, it's not one final thing, there'd be a million things, but one more thing. Suppose you hear this term, full employment. We have full employment. What's that mean? Does that mean everybody has a job? And the answer is, no, it does not mean everybody has a job. What it means is that there's no cyclical unemployment. That all the unemployment we have is that microeconomic kind, the natural kind of unemployment, this natural rate of unemployment. Okay? So if we hear the term full employment, what that means is the unemployment rate's equal to the natural rate of unemployment. In 1946, the Congress passed a law. Let me kind of give you a little bit of history, not very much, we'll come back to it later. But in the 1930s, of course, the United States had a depression, the Great Depression of the 1930s. Started as a recession, got worse and worse due to the Federal Reserve's mistaken policies, and finally we ended up having that recession turn into a very bad downturn. A business cycle. By the way, what is a depression? Some people, how's that definition go? A recession is when my neighbor's out of work. A depression is when I'm out of work. So that is one definition. But generally what we say is, look, the economy's got these normal downturns, and if the downturn is real steep, they'll start talking about that being a depression. Hey, that's a lot bigger downturn than we're used to. So anyway, in the 1930s, we had a depression. The unemployment rate in the 1930s got to be about 25%. I think that was 1933. It was 25%. That's real severe, of course. And so what happened was, at the recession, or the depression ended really when the United States got into World War II. After the war was over, it ended, of course, in 1945. Next year, 1946, the Congress is looking back and sort of going, boy, we've come through some very difficult times here, you know. Not only did we fight this, this threat to our safety and freedom, but before that, we were in sort of an economic struggle for survival, for existence. We were trying to overcome this depression and not having very much luck at it. So what we need to do, this is a Congress, what we need to do is we need to pass a law that shows our commitment, our permanent, our ongoing commitment. We take responsibility for preventing anything like this again. It had already happened before. When we got into that depression, the idea was, well, you know, the economy will kind of fix itself. Yeah, we don't like this problem, but it'll go away on its own. That was kind of the attitude. And then Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and he said, oh, you know, what we got to do is we got to be bold, we got to experiment. So he came to office, and he was bold and experimented and didn't fix it. And so we went through a period, it depends on when you date this, but roughly 1929 to 1941, about a 12-year period, when the economy was really sort of down, not doing very good at all. And so then in 1946, the Congress passes a Full Employment Act, and that Full Employment Act had several components, but one is just a commitment. The United States government will take responsibility for keeping the unemployment rate from getting out of hand the way it did in the 30s. We're going to fight depressions. Okay. And the second thing they did is they established something called the Council of Economic Advisors. CEA, Council Economic Advisors. And what the Council of Economic Advisors is a three-person group of economists that advise the President. The President, since 1946, has had his own staff of economists, and their job is to basically study the economy all the time and talk about the problems with the President, talk about the problems that are being encountered, talk about some of the solutions, proposals that are coming forth, and so forth. They're a source of economic data. Every year the President puts out something called the Economic Report of the President, and the Council of Economic Advisors have really done most of the work of preparing that Economic Report of the President, but it's got the President's main initiatives, his economic initiatives in there. It's got an explanation for them, commentary on how the economy is performing, major problems the economy is facing. There's a lot of economic data in the back. But anyway, so 1946, that's when we said, okay, we're going to get tough against this. And what's happened since 1946, it doesn't mean that there's any permanent solution. We don't know what's permanent. We don't know what will happen next year. But since 1946, we have not had any severe downturns in the economy of the nature that we had in the 1930s. And so for more than 50 years, you know, that's worked out pretty well. But who knows, like I say, about tomorrow. Back when we had this depression, basically what happened was people did not talk about the economy very much, did not study the economy very much, weren't very familiar with it. There were some economists out there, but they were more interested in microeconomics than they were macroeconomics. And so when the depression came along, most economists, most policymakers, their attitude was, this will go away, it always has in the past. And I'm saying that is not our attitude now. I don't expect we will have another depression anytime soon, and the reason for that is we study this stuff a lot more now. There's a lot of economists around the country, really around the world, who are studying these same type of issues that were so critical and misunderstood back in the 30s, and those misunderstandings don't exist now. We've got new misunderstandings now. And so if we do have... Here's the type of depression we would have if we had one now. It would be triggered from something like this. Some big bank in, let's say, Japan or Europe does not pay some big bank in the United States when it was supposed to. And this money, by the way, moves electronically between banks. It's not like they got some courier with a bag and you fill it up with cash and then jump in your Ford and drive across town and hand it over. It's all done electronically. So if we were going to have a depression, it might get started like this. Some big bank, let's say in Germany, fails to pay $5 billion to a big bank in the United States when it was supposed to. But that big bank in the United States was counting on that $5 billion coming in order to pay somebody it owed money to. And it was thinking that money was going to come today. Oh, here comes the signal. We're sending you money right now. So now this big bank in New York sends out some money, and maybe that big bank in Germany just doesn't come through on the promise. And so now this big bank in New York has already sent some money to somebody else, thinking it was going to be replenished before the day was out, and it wasn't. So now you got a big bank here in New York that didn't get to $5 billion, sent out $5 billion someplace. It's now $5 billion in the hole. Maybe something happens like this. Somebody hears about it. Maybe a couple of other small banks say, hey, how come you're not paying us on time? And the big banker says, well, I paid this $5 billion out, and that ran me out of cash, and I'm not going to be liquid until that big bank from Germany pays me, so I can't pay you. And so these banks start talking about it, and the word starts spreading, and people start getting a little panicky, and they run down to this big bank, the one who's not paying its creditors, and they run down here and say, hey, I heard that you're having trouble paying your creditors. I want all my money out of my checking account. And so then the bank starts saying, well, okay, here you go, but you know, they're not real flush with cash. They just paid out $5 billion they didn't have. And so then maybe real quick they just run out of cash, and then the panic starts. And not only the panic toward that bank, but it's like, hey, if this has happened to such and such a big bank, could that be happening to my bank? It's a much smaller bank. I better go down to my bank and get my cash. So everybody in the country starts running toward their bank to get cash. The banks are handing out the cash, and after a while the banks say, we have no more cash, we have to close our doors. And now the businesses who need to borrow money in order to just finance their ongoing business activities, pay the bills, pay the employees, those businesses go down to the bank to borrow, but the bank's got its doors closed. It's out of business. And so borrowing can't take place. And so companies that can't borrow, they can't pay their employees, so they tell the employees to go home. And the employees who go home, now they have no paycheck, so they can't afford to buy anything. And so this sort of gets started through an accident, and this is hypothetical, admittedly, but some accident comes along and creates a situation where this bank doesn't have money coming in, the money went out, it's caught in a financial bind, the panic starts, it spreads to other banks, all of a sudden it's nationwide, it's a huge thing, and it's very difficult to stop. If we have a depression rivaling the one we had back in the 1930s, it'll be something like that. It won't get started the way the one did in the 1930s, but it'll get started in a new way, which is more unique to our own situation, electronic payments and so forth. In addition to unemployment, I mean, we're talking about unemployment here, but you should keep something else in mind. It's not just unemployed people, but there are bankruptcies, corporate failures. There's a lot of other things that go on during these times when the economy turns down and unemployment picks up. So does a number of bankruptcies, so does a number of corporate failures, and so forth. So what we're really talking about when we say there's a high unemployment rate, usually we're talking about a high amount of sort of economic misery. Right? It's not just just focused on those people who are out of work, but let's say you own stock in a company and there's a lot of people out of work, but also now the company is not selling its products and its profits are down, maybe having to sell off some divisions. That would be bad for your shares of stock, and so this would come back and affect you even if you've still got your job. And so the unemployment rate being high is a sign really that things are wrong in the economy and there's a lot of people suffering. Let's talk about unemployment insurance. And sometimes people call it unemployment compensation. But it is an insurance type of a policy. Not a private insurance, a government insurance. But basically here's what happened. We won't try and get into the technical details of this, but basically the idea is this, is if you're a full-time worker, at a certain point after you've worked for a few months, you become eligible for unemployment compensation if you would lose your job, certainly through no fault of your own. If you get laid off, there are certain circumstances under which you can get fired for, let's say, being dishonest or fighting or whatever. You can lose your job and not qualify for unemployment compensation. But generally speaking, people who have worked full-time for several months, they are insured where that if they lose their jobs, let's say the company shuts down or lays off employees for a few months, then the workers go on unemployment compensation and receive a few $100s a week if your earnings are significant, a few $100s a week to tide you over. Here's one effect. I want you to think about this. If we have unemployment compensation or unemployment insurance, that sort of tells people, hey, the government's going to bail you out if you get into a little bit of a financial problem. And so people then, they start saying, you know, I can bargain a little harder for higher wages than before. And the reason I can bargain for higher wages, if I go overboard and I lose my job, still I have somebody that will help me out of this situation. So what I'm saying to you is unemployment compensation, it's got the compassionate side of it, but the other side is it may lead employees to bargain a little higher for wages and may cause them to be unemployed or a little more likely to be unemployed. Final point, I want to talk about something called the misery index or the discomfort index. They're just two different names for the same thing. The index itself is equal to the inflation rate plus the unemployment rate. And I don't remember the specific numbers, but the last year Jimmy Carter was president, I think the unemployment or the inflation rate was on the order of 13%, and I think the unemployment rate was on the order of 7%, and so the misery index then was 20% during that year. These are just two sort of bad things that make life uncomfortable, and we add them together. This year the rate is closer to 2 and 4, closer to 6% than to the 20 that it was before. So there's much higher level of economic satisfaction with the performance of the economy. Next time we'll talk about the third of these topics, gross domestic product. So long.